3, 2, 1.
This is Captain Shadow. Welcome aboard. Today's flight will take us from the picturesque Lesand, located on the west coast of Norway, to Trondheim, the heart of the Trøndelag region. Our route, though short, leads through incredibly picturesque landscapes of fjords and mountains which hold many stories. But today, we'll focus on those that send shivers down your spine. We are flying on a Boeing 737. A machine with impressive capabilities and a rich history. Unfortunately, the history of this model and its earlier versions has also been tragically recorded in the annals of aviation. From famous disasters to dramatic landings, this type of aircraft has seen it all, from explosions at high altitudes to fighting for life at airports. The Boeing 737 is a legend that inspires both admiration and respect. Our journey begins on runway 25 at Lausanne Vigra Airport. The air is cool and a light fog falls from the clouds, as if nature itself wanted to emphasize the atmosphere of this story. In just over an hour, we will land on runway 09 in Trondheim. It's a short flight, but enough to look at the fascinating and dramatic aviation stories that these regions hide. During our journey, we will share stories of heroism, human determination, and unexpected tragedies. Each of these stories is a lesson, a reminder of how thin the line is that separates routine from disaster in the world of aviation. And now, before we take off, I would like to sincerely thank you for supporting this channel. Your engagement is the driving force that allows me to tell these stories. Every thumbs up, comment, or financial support is a sign to me that it's worth continuing this journey. Fasten your seatbelts and get ready for takeoff. It's time to rise into the air and uncover the dark secrets that the sky and earth hide. Are you ready? If so, let's go. It was a normal Tuesday morning at the Lausanne Airport. A calm, routine atmosphere prevails. People rush to check-in, nervously glance at their watches, and look for their gates. Partner Flight 394 was supposed to be an ordinary journey for its passengers. 89 people boarded the plane, some on business, others returning to their families. All this took place on September 8, 1989, and the aircraft they boarded was the Convair 580, a model that had been flying for 2 decades. Back then, no one knew that this day would go down in aviation history as an example of a tragic confluence of circumstances and negligence. The flight was supposed to take passengers from Lausanne to Hamburg, but it never reached its destination. The crew on board were professionals who had spent thousands of hours in the air. But now, let's pause for a moment. We're pushing back from the gate and starting to prepare for taxiing. You hear the sound of engines. Do you feel the slight vibrations under your feet? At such moments, I always think of those who were on board in a similar moment, completely unaware that something would go wrong. Maria Svensson, a flight attendant with 15 years of experience, was in a great mood that day. This flight was supposed to be her last before a long-awaited vacation. She had planned a trip to Spain, where a small house by the sea awaited her. Maria knew this route like the back of her hand. She had served passengers on similar stretches hundreds of times. She smiled at everyone and helped with luggage as if nothing could spoil her day. Johan Andersen, the captain of the aircraft, had more than 20 years of experience. He was one of those pilots who inspired confidence with their mere presence. Just before the flight, he spoke on the phone with his 7-year-old daughter. He promised to read her favorite fairy tale about princesses that evening. Her laughter still echoed in his head as he relayed readiness information to the control tower. On board was also Lars, a businessman returning from an important meeting. He hoped to make it in time for his son's birthday. In his black notebook, he wrote down a few notes he planned to discuss with his team the next day. Next to him sat an older couple, Inga and Harold, who were returning from a sentimental trip to their hometown. They had been married for over 50 years and always traveled together. These people, just like us now, as we taxied to the runway, had no idea what awaited them. Now imagine this moment. Passengers buckled up, Maria checking the cabin after the last announcements. Captain Johann focused at the controls, staring at the runway. The engines of the Convair 580 will soon reach full power, and the airplane will disappear into the clouds. This is a daily aviation ritual, full of routine, yet it also hides an inherent element of unpredictability. It is precisely in such moments that reflection comes. How many decisions, how many small elements must work perfectly for each flight to end safely? Set parking brake. Turn on CAS. Turn on landing lights. Activate strobe lights. Flaps to position 10. Parking brake released. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Shadow speaking. Our Boeing 737 is lining up on the runway. In a moment, we will take off from the ground. Look out the window and say goodbye to Lezond. Ahead of us is a route full of history and full of emotions. It's time to take to the air. Rotate. Positive rate. Gear up. Flaps to position 2. Retract flaps. Engage autopilot. Dear passengers, we are now climbing and can return to our story. The first 20 minutes of the Partner 394 flight were calm. In the cockpit, Captain Johann announced over the speakers, "In about 30 minutes, we will reach our optimal flight route. Please relax and enjoy the views." Meanwhile, in the cabin, Maria, with a smile on her face, was serving coffee and tea. Everything seemed fine. No one paid attention to the subtle vibrations that appeared under their feet. The Convair 580 was a solid machine, but its design, created back in the 50s, had its characteristic features, including vibrations during flight. Nothing out of the ordinary, the crew thought, but Captain Johann looked at one of the indicators and frowned. Something was not right. He pressed the switch button, trying to get more detailed data on the operation of the right engine. A brief silence fell in the cockpit. The co-pilot looked at Johann and finally asked, "Do you hear that? That sound? Something is wrong," the captain confirmed, nodding. The vibrating, intensifying sounds coming from the right engine became more and more pronounced. Maria, being at the rear of the plane, noticed something else. The subtle shocks of the floor started to become more noticeable. She looked around at the passengers. Some began whispering to each other. Others just looked out the windows, as if looking for confirmation that everything was okay. Maria reassured them, smiling and explaining that it was just mild turbulence, nothing unusual. But when she returned to her workstation, she noticed that the drinks in the plastic cups started to tremble slightly. In the cockpit, Captain Johann was still trying to identify the problem. He started transmitting a message to the air traffic control tower, reporting unusual readings from one of the engines. The co-pilot translated data from the systems onto a checklist, looking for a possible source of the problem. But neither of them yet knew that the situation was much more serious than it seemed. For now, the passenger cabin was filled with calm, interrupted only by quiet conversations and the sounds of the engines working. None of the passengers had any idea that in the next few minutes, their peaceful flight would turn into a tragedy that they would remember forever. At 22,000 feet, Captain Johann Anderson noticed the first troubling signs. One of the indicators showed irregularities in the right engine's operation. Vibrations that became more pronounced with each passing minute. It was something Johann hadn't seen in years. The problem, though subtle, began to permeate every aspect of the engine's operation. And the data appearing on the screen looked increasingly alarming. A low, prolonged warning sound swept through the cockpit. Johann frowned, looking at the oil temperature readings. The values were rapidly rising, approaching a critical level. It was a sign that something in the engine cooling system was no longer working as it should. The machine's vibrations were becoming more noticeable, though still imperceptible to the passengers. "Lars, prepare the emergency procedures for the right engine," Captain whispered, trying to control the rising tension. The first officer began entering data into the system, and their gazes met for a moment. They were aware that the problem was deepening quickly. In the passenger cabin, there was silence, broken only by the gentle clinking of cups on trays. Maria Svensson, the head of the cabin crew, moved between the rows, watching the passengers. Most were busy with their affairs. A young couple in the middle row was watching a movie on a tablet. An older man was dozing off, holding a newspaper. However, Maria felt slight vibrations under her feet. These were not ordinary turbulences. While serving drinks, she stopped by an older woman who looked up at her with concern. "Is everything all right?" the woman asked, clenching her hands on the armrests. Maria smiled, though many questions had already arisen in her mind. "Of course, it's just like turbulence." However, the vibrations were beginning to be felt more significantly. A few passengers looked at each other uneasily. Some began to look around, seeking cabin crew to ask questions. Meanwhile, another alarm sounded in the cockpit. Johann looked at the panel. The oil pressure in the right engine had sharply dropped. The temperature had reached a dangerous level, threatening the further operation of the power unit. "Engine number 2 is losing power. We need to make a decision," the captain said. His voice was calm but firm. He decided to shut down the engine. The onboard system responded immediately, and the vibrations suddenly ceased, giving way to an unsettling silence. Maria noticed how the airplane slightly tilted. The vibrations stopped, but a subtle drop in thrust was noticeable. The passengers began whispering among themselves, and the seriousness of the situation started to dawn on them. Nonetheless, Maria maintained her professional calm, approaching a young mother with a child. Captain Johann informed air traffic control of his decision. "This is partner 394. We've shut down the right engine, requesting priority for return to Lee's Island." The controller responded quickly and calmly. "Understood, partner 394. We're opening airspace for you." More alarms appeared on the cockpit indicators, and Johann knew that every move now had to be carefully considered. The airplane flying on one engine lost some of its stability, but was still under the cruise control. In the passenger cabin, Maria moved between the rows, reassuring people who began to ask questions. The older woman grabbed her hand again. What's happening? Something's wrong, isn't it? Maria leaned in, trying to maintain professionalism. Everything is under control. We are returning to the airport. But the tension was visible in her eyes. As the airplane began to gently lower its altitude, Captain prepared the machine for an emergency landing. He knew that time was not on their side. It happened in a flash. Just a moment ago, despite issues with one of the engines, the airplane was flying steadily. But suddenly, the entire machine violently tilted to the right, nearly at a 45-degree angle. Passengers felt a strong jerk that pressed them into their seats. Chaos ensued in the cabin. Red emergency lights came on all at once, as if heralding an impending disaster. Maria, who was just walking through the middle section of the cabin, lost her balance. The tray of drinks she was carrying flew from her hands, and plastic cups scattered across the floor. Passengers began to scream. Those who had been conversing calmly just moments before now clutched their armrests tightly. An elderly man in the first row tried to stand up, but immediately fell back into his seat. The airplane shook. Oxygen masks fell from the ceiling, dangling in front of people's faces. The air was filled with an unnatural noise, the low, muffled roar of the right engine. That had completely shut down, mixed with the warning signals and the panic of the passengers. In the cockpit, Captain Johan Anderson tried to control the situation. The aircraft was unstable, and the controls did not seem to respond as they should. The tilt to the right was becoming more pronounced. Lars, the first officer, pressed various switches attempting to restore the automatic systems, but nothing worked. We've lost hydraulics. All systems are down. Johan didn't respond. His hands clenched the controls, and his face was focused almost stone-like. He knew he had to act quickly. In such moments, there is no room for panic. Maria, trying to maintain her balance in the tilted cabin, reached an elderly woman in the last row who was crying. She grabbed her hand firmly and confidently. "Please, hold on. It will be okay," she shouted, trying to shout over the noise. But even she wasn't sure of her words. At that moment, the airplane jerked again, even more violently. People began to cry, scream, and pray. A child in the front rows burst into tears, and his mother tried to comfort him, barely controlling her own emotions. The whole situation lasted only a few seconds, but for the passengers and crew, each moment seemed like an eternity. The airplane was still in the air, but no one knew for how long. Johan clenched his hands on the controls, which seemed to disobey. Every muscle in his body was tense, every nerve focused on one thing, keeping the machine in the air. He knew that 89 lives depended on his skills, on his ability to do everything to save them. More warning signals rang out in the cockpit. Lars desperately tried to take control of the emergency systems, but none of them functioned as they should. Finally, he turned to the captain. "We have to try manually." Johan nodded, though he knew that controlling the airplane under such conditions was nearly an impossible task. The right tilt began to stabilize, but the machine still shook, and steerability was severely limited. In the cabin, Maria fought to keep the passengers calm, though she barely controlled her own fear. She quickly moved to the first row, where a young man in panic was trying to unbuckle his seatbelt. "Please sit down. Please don't get up," she called out firmly, placing her hand on his shoulder. Passengers looked at her, searching for a bit of hope. Meanwhile, Johan faced another problem. The airplane began to lose altitude. Slowly, but inevitably, they were descending. The captain knew they had little time to stabilize the flight. "Keep trying. Focus on the controls," he said to Lars, who was controlling the throttle of the only functioning engine. With each passing second, the situation became more dramatic, but Johan was not about to give up. His mind operated at full throttle, analyzing all possible scenarios. In such moments, seconds counted, and every decision could determine the fate of everyone on board. The airplane continued to fall. From 22,000 feet, they descended to 15,000, and the rate of descent did not decrease. Johan looked at the indicators, trying to find a way to steer the machine. "We're at 10,000 feet, Lars said, his voice tense, almost trembling. At that time, Maria was buckling the seatbelt of an elderly woman in the last row. The woman held her hand, sobbing quietly. "Everything will be okay," Maria said, although her own voice betrayed her fear. At 8,000 feet, Johan managed to stabilize the descent, but they were still far from a safe altitude. The noise in the cabin subsided, and passengers remained in tense anticipation. Everyone on board knew that the next few minutes would decide their lives. Time was slipping away, and hope was fading. At 1:13:47, radar lost contact with Partner 394. The plane vanished from the flight controller screens. In the last seconds, Johann sent a message that would be remembered by all. "We're trying to come back. We're trying." His voice was composed without a trace of panic, even though he knew how slim the chances were of saving the aircraft. Seconds later, silence fell. The plane struck the water surface with unimaginable force. No one on board survived. 89 people, passengers and crew. Everyone who boarded the plane that day ended their lives in one tragic moment. The sea swallowed the wreckage, and the only witness to the disaster was the emptiness of the Norwegian fjords. 89 families were waiting that day for news about their loved ones. Johann's daughter sat by the window waiting for Dad to come home and read her favorite fairy tale. The phone rang late in the afternoon. It was not the message his wife was waiting for. Maria Svensson had planned a vacation in Spain. The day of departure was marked in her calendar, but it remained just an empty reminder. Family, friends, loved ones all were left on Earth shaken and plunged into mourning. The aviation world froze. The Partner 394 disaster became one of the most tragic events in the history of Norwegian aviation. What was discovered during the investigation shocked everyone. The cause of the disaster was a flaw in the right propulsion unit, a small part that was not an original element of the aircraft. In its place, a cheap substitute screw was installed, which meant no certifications. Saving a few dollars cost the lives of 89 people. What seemed like a minor detail turned out to be a crucial error. The owner of the aircraft Partner was accused of failing to fulfill its duties in using uncertified parts, which opened a wide debate on safety in aviation. The tragedy of Partner Flight 394 changed aviation forever. After the disaster, stricter regulations regarding the certification of even the smallest part of the machine were introduced. Screws, panels, components, everything had to undergo detailed inspection before it could board. Today, when you board a plane, you can be sure that every part of it has been thoroughly checked. Aviation has become one of the safest means of transport in the world, but the price for this certainty was unimaginably high. Next time you're on a plane, look out the window. See the beauty of the clouds, feel the calm of the flight. Think of those who sacrificed their lives so that each subsequent trip could be safer. Captain Johann Maria Lars and all the passengers of Partner Flight 394 left behind more than memories. They left a lesson. Their story reminds us that even the smallest details matter. Thanks to them, your flight today is safer. Now I will take you to another remarkable story that happened over Central America. This is a tale of the courage and determination of pilots who faced an unimaginable task, saving the passengers of TACA Flight 110. But before we move on to this extraordinary fight for survival, I would like to thank you for being here and listening to these stories. If you like these tales and want to support my work, every gesture like it, commenting, or financial support helps me create more episodes and delve into the world of aviation mysteries. Your support is the power that allows me to continue this journey. Each thumbs up, every comment is a sign that these stories are important and reach your hearts. And now, time for TACA Flight 110, a story that shows that even in the darkest moments, you can find a light of hope. TACA Flight 110 was to be another routine flight. On board the Boeing 7373T0, there were 38 passengers and a 7-member crew. The aircraft, which had just joined the TACA fleet 2 weeks earlier, took off from Belize City and was headed for New Orleans. However, the weather conditions were far from ideal. A storm raged over the Gulf of Mexico, rain drummed on the fuselage, and lightning intermittently illuminated the dark sky. At the controls was Captain Carlos Dardano, pilot with enviable experience despite his young age. He had years of flying in extreme conditions, and his story was unique. In 1982, during the Civil War in El Salvador, Carlos was shot in the head and lost his left eye. However, this did not stop him from obtaining a commercial pilot's license. Beside him worked First Officer Jametso Lopez with over 12,000 flight hours, and Captain Arturo Soli, a flight instructor who served as an observer that day. The aircraft struggled with hail and strong turbulence. The rain reduced visibility to almost zero. "A real wall of water," said Carlos, looking through the windshield. "Keep power at cruising level. Let's not push the engines to their limits. Jimezzo instructed, looking at the indicators. The storm was so strong that hail hit the engine covers, creating deep marks on their surfaces. Even the experienced crew knew that such conditions were a real test for any machine. The airplane moved like a can in a blender tossed up and down by gusty winds. Despite this, the crew remained calm. Carlos held the controls firmly, his gaze focused. We'll get through this, he thought. But the storm had other plans. At an altitude of 16,500 feet, the situation suddenly changed. In an instant, the lights in the cabin went out, and all the cockpit indicators stopped working, except for the altimeter, an artificial horizon which had their own emergency power. Silence prevailed, broken only by the sound of rain and lightning. Both engines have shut down, said Carlos, pulling his hand away from the throttle. Jimezzo looked at the indicators and confirmed. We have a complete power loss. The Boeing 7373T0, of the most advanced machines in its class, had become a glider. Carlos immediately took control and started the emergency procedure. With the emergency power unit APU, activated basic systems were restored. But the most crucial engine power was still missing. In the passenger cabin, people began to realize something was wrong. Flight attendants tried to calm the passengers, though they themselves were worried. Maria Velasquez walked between the rows, making sure everyone had their seatbelts fastened. Carlos and Jimezzo began the engine restart procedure. The first attempts brought partial success. The left engine started, but too much fuel introduction caused it to overheat and hot start. The same happened with the right engine. Its blades began to melt, and the crew was forced to shut down both units. We can't risk a fire, said Jimezzo, his voice calm but firm. Carlos nodded, maneuvering the aircraft, which was gliding at a decreasing altitude. After several more attempts, it was clear the engines were not generating thrust, and further, attempts to restart could completely damage the system. We're closing the restart procedure. We need to focus on landing, Carlos decided, watching the falling altitude indicators. The crew understood that their only option was to find a suitable place for an emergency landing. Preparations for the final phase of the flight began. Descending to an altitude of 1,500 feet, the crew braced for the worst. Carlos initially planned to waterland on one of the channels, but at the last moment, he spotted something else, a long, straight surface. That's the levee. Let's try there, he said, pointing to the narrow strip running parallel to the channel. Captain Arturo Soli, who had been observing the situation, nodded. If you can keep the machine on track, it might work. Carlos positioned the aircraft correctly, using a side-slip maneuver, reacquiring utmost precision. The Boeing 737, weighing several tons, descended at a speed of over 250 kilometers per hour. Every bump, every obstacle could lead to a catastrophe. The crew in the passenger cabin issued the final instructions. Prepare for emergency landing. Maria, sitting in her seat, clenched her hands on the belts. The aircraft touched the levee with tremendous force. The tires trembled on the uneven surface, and the aerodynamic brakes did the rest. After several hundred meters, the machine stopped, surrounded by mud and vegetation. No one was killed. The aircraft made an emergency landing on a narrow levee on NASA property. Carlos Dardano, his crew, and all passengers survived without serious injuries. It was the first landing of its kind in history. When silence fell, people began to cheer, cry, and thank for their lives. Carlos turned to his crew. We did this together, he said, smiling faintly. The story of TACA Flight 110 remains a testament to the courage, skill, and composure of pilots who, even in the worst conditions, did not give up. Following the emergency landing of TACA Flight 110 NTSB, investigators began a detailed examination of the causes of the failure. The key issue turned out to be atmospheric conditions, hail, and a huge amount of water that got into the engines of the Boeing 7373T0. These engines were designed to repel hail, but only of a certain size. However, smaller particles could penetrate inside and accumulate, especially when the engines were running at idle, as was the case during the flight through the storm. Water and melting hail gradually flooded the engines, leading to their complete shutdown. Attempts to restart lead to a hot start, a situation where too much fuel causes excessive heating, and, in this case, the melting of turbine blades. As a result, the engines did not produce thrust, forcing the crew to shut them down. Another problem was the lack of drains that were supposed to remove water from inside the engines. As a result of the investigation, changes were made to the engine design. The shape of the fan covers was changed to more effectively drain water, and more drains were added. Thanks to these modifications, engines became more resistant to extreme weather conditions, significantly improving flight safety worldwide. The emergency landing of TACA Flight 110 would not have ended successfully without the extraordinary composure and heroism of the crew. Captain Carlos Dardano, despite his young age, demonstrated skills that went down in aviation history. Losing his left eye in a gunshot during the Civil War in El Salvador did not stop him from achieving mastery in piloting aircraft. We must not forget the cabin crew led by Maria Velasquez. As panic in the cabin grew, the flight attendants ensured the safety of passengers, helping them fasten their belts and prepare for landing. Maria, despite immense stress, maintained composure, allowing passengers to believe that everything was under control. When both engines failed, Carlos quickly assessed the situation and spotted the levee as the only chance to save the passengers. His first officer, Jametso Lopez, supported Carlos at every stage of the crisis. Thanks to his experience, it was possible to attempt an engine restart and then prepare the machine for an emergency landing. He was also supported by Captain Arturo Soli, a flight instructor who served as an observer that day. Together with Carlos and Jametso, he analyzed the situation and helped plan the approach to landing. After landing on the narrow levee, everyone on board was safe and sound. The success of the TACA 110 crew is still analyzed in aviation schools worldwide as an example of professionalism, courage, and effective cooperation in a crisis. The story of TACA 110 is also proof of how small design errors can lead to significant problems. Although the storm was extreme, the engine failure was caused by design details that had not been thoroughly analyzed previously. Thanks to changes made after this incident, similar failures are now almost impossible. Every flight is a test of cooperation between technology and people. TACA 110 reminds us that while machines can fail, the experience, composure, and cool-headedness of pilots can be the last line of defense that saves dozens of lives. It was the 28th of April, 1988, a warm and sunny day in Hawaii. Aloha Airlines Flight 243 was meant to be a short, routine journey. The airplane, a Boeing 737-200, was scheduled to fly from Hilo on the island of Hawaii to Honolulu on Oahu. On board were 18 passengers and 5 crew members. The commanding pilot was 44-year-old Robert Schornsteimer, with over 8,500 hours in the air. Beside him sat the first officer, 36-year-old Madeline Tompkins, a remarkable woman in aviation of that era with an impressive record of 8,000 flight hours. The entire crew had the full confidence of the passengers it was supposed to be just another day at work. At 1:25 in the afternoon, the aircraft took off. The flight proceeded smoothly, and the passengers enjoyed views of the blue ocean and islands. No one anticipated that their journey would soon turn into a nightmare. When the Boeing reached cruising altitude, 24,000 feet, the peaceful atmosphere began to change. Without warning, a sudden cabin decompression occurred. With a bang resembling an explosion, the upper part of the fuselage at the front of the aircraft, the cabin roof literally disappeared. Passengers suddenly found themselves exposed to the open sky. Imagine this scene. You're sitting in an airplane and suddenly the entire interior is exposed like a convertible. Terrifying noise wind at speeds over 500 kilometers per hour. And the temperature drops below zero in an instant. Under such conditions, the human body struggles to survive and breathing becomes almost impossible. Flight attendant Clarabelle Lansing, experienced and beloved by the crew, was sucked out of the airplane at the moment of decompression. At that moment, no one had time to understand what had happened. The rest of the crew, despite the shock, immediately began actions to calm the passengers and ensure their safety. In the cockpit, Captain Schornsteimer and First Officer Madalenia's situation that seemed hopeless. Imagine trying to drive a car on the highway when the windshield suddenly disappears and rushing air hits your face with tremendous force. Such a hurricane was invading the pilot's cabin, drowning out all sounds and making breathing difficult. The onboard instruments were going haywire, and fragments of the aircraft's skin were breaking off and swirling in the air like leaves during a storm. Despite this chaos, Schornsteimer and Tompkins knew they had to act quickly. Every second was a matter of life and death. "We are descending," shouted the captain, although his voice was lost in the deafening roar of the wind. Tompkins, fighting the force of the air, trying to wrench the controls from her hands, nodded. Their hands were white from gripping the instruments tightly, and their eyes were focused on the flickering indicators. At the same time, the passenger cabin was in utter turmoil. Passengers suddenly exposed to the open air at an altitude of 24,000 feet experienced indescribable terror. It was as if you suddenly found yourself at the top of the world's tallest roller coaster without any safety restraints, feeling the wind trying to carry you away. The temperature dropped below zero, and breathing became difficult due to the thin air. The flight attendants, despite their own shock and injuries, moved to assist the passengers. Lanita McClellan, one of the crew members, crawled along the floor, trying to reach the nearest oxygen masks. "Please fasten your seatbelts. Breathe deeply," she shouted, though her words were barely audible. Her courage in those moments was invaluable. Passengers clung desperately to their seats. Some prayed, others cried. Parents shielded their children with their own bodies, and strangers held hands, offering each other comfort. Imagine being in an elevator that suddenly starts to fall, your heart leaps into your throat, and time seems to slow down. The captain knew that the only chance for survival was an immediate landing. The nearest airport was Kahului on Maui, but reaching it with a damaged aircraft was a massive challenge. The fuselage could further disintegrate at any moment, and the plane's maneuverability was severely compromised. It's like trying to steer a boat with a cracked hull during a storm. Air traffic control in Honolulu received the Mayday signal, but communication was intermittent. "Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Aloha 243 loss of fuselage. We need immediate landing." The pilots transmitted battling noise and interference. The controllers, realizing the gravity of the situation, cleared the airspace and prepared the airport for an emergency landing. During the descent, turbulence was so severe that the plane shook like a leaf in the wind. Passengers experienced forces as if an elephant sat on their chest. Some began to lose consciousness due to lack of oxygen and shock. "Is this the end?" they thought, looking at the expanse of ocean waves below. In the cockpit, the situation was critical. One of the engines began showing signs of failure. Temperature gauges were rising, and power was dropping. It's like being in a car on the highway when all the warning lights start flashing and the engine loses power. The final minutes before landing were the most tense. The plane was approaching the airport at a dangerously high speed. The brakes might not hold, and the risk of overshooting the runway was enormous. "Hold the course. Watch the speed," warned Tompkins, monitoring the instruments. Their cooperation was crucial in these decisive moments. Finally, the plane's wheels touched the runway. The impact was powerful, and everyone on board felt a strong jolt. The brakes were working at full capacity, and the tires screeched, leaving marks on the asphalt. The plane began to slow down, but the danger was not over yet. Would they manage to stop before the end of the runway? Would the structure withstand the final stresses? When the plane finally came to a halt, a silence fell over the cabin, broken only by sobs and sighs of relief. But the crew knew they had to act swiftly. There was a risk of fire or other damage. "Evacuate everyone off the plane immediately," the flight attendants shouted, opening the emergency exits. The escape slides were deployed, and passengers began to disembark. It wasn't without problems. Some exits were blocked by damage, and some passengers were in shock, unable to move. The crew, despite their own injuries, assisted those who needed help. It was a true test of character and professionalism. Emergency services were already waiting on the tarmac. Firefighters and medics sprang into action, providing first aid and extinguishing small fires that had arisen due to the damage. Passengers were being treated and transported to hospitals. Everyone was in shock, but alive. What they had experienced would remain in their memories forever. Unfortunately, after the evacuation, it became clear that flight attendant Clarabelle Lansing was missing. She had been sucked out of the plane at the moment of decompression. It was a huge loss for the crew and passengers, who remembered her as a person full of warmth and professionalism. As emotions subsided, everyone realized the miracle that had occurred. The plane, despite such severe damage, had managed to land safely, and most people on board survived. This was due not only to the experience and composure of the pilots, but also to the extraordinary courage and dedication of the entire crew. What would you do in such a situation? Could you remain calm in the face of such danger? This story shows the remarkable capabilities of the human spirit when facing extreme challenges. Imagine that moment when everything around you is falling apart, and you have to make decisions upon which the lives of many people depend. This dramatic finale of Aloha Airlines Flight 243 Forever changed the face of aviation. It is not only a story of tragedy and loss, but also of heroism and determination. Thanks to this story, we understand the importance of safety procedures and regular technical inspections. It is a lesson that has made the skies safer for all of us. After landing, it was discovered that out of 94 people on board, 65 sustained injuries, but everyone except flight attendant Clarabelle Lansing survived. This event shocked the aviation world, but also initiated significant changes in procedures and technical inspections. The investigation revealed that the cause of the decompression was material fatigue caused by many years of operating the aircraft in challenging humid conditions. The Boeing 737-200 performed short, frequent flights, which exposed its fuselage to constant pressure changes. Cracks that developed as a result of these cycles were not detected during earlier inspections. As a result of this incident, the Federal Aviation Administration (FAA) tightened requirements for aircraft inspections, especially for those used in tropical regions. More advanced technologies were also introduced to detect cracks in the structures of aircraft. The story of Aloha Airlines Flight 243 serves as a reminder that aviation, although extremely safe, requires constant attention and meticulous care for every detail. The courage of the crew and the professionalism of the pilots helped prevent an even greater tragedy, and today's procedures are the result of lessons learned from this dramatic event. If you wish to explore more such stories, please support my channel. Your assistance allows me to share insights about aviation with passion and attention to every detail. Remember, behind every such story lie heroes and lessons that make our skies safer. As we reflect on the miraculous landing of Aloha Airlines Flight 243, we're reminded of the incredible resilience and bravery displayed in the face of imminent disaster. Such stories not only highlight the triumph of human spirit over adversity, but also serve as pivotal lessons in aviation safety. Another profound example that embodies these themes is the gripping tale of Brothen's Safe Flight 239, which unfolded a decade earlier, yet remains etched in the annals of aviation history. Before we delve into this captivating account, I want to extend my heartfelt gratitude for your continued support. Your engagement allows me to share these significant stories, shedding light on events that have shaped the aviation industry into what it is today. It's through your enthusiasm that we can explore these narratives with the depth and respect they deserve. But now, ladies and gentlemen, Captain Shadow, I am speaking to you for the last time today. In about 6 minutes, we will be landing. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your belongings are secured. On a frosty winter evening, December 23rd, 1972, Brothen's Safe Flight 239 was preparing for what was expected to be a routine journey from Lausanne Airport, Vigra to Oslo Airport, Fornebu, the aircraft, a Fokker F-28 Fellowship, a twin-engine jet renowned for its reliability, was carrying 45 passengers and a crew eager to reunite with loved ones just before Christmas. The weather, however, was far from cooperative. A dense fog had settled over Oslo, significantly reducing visibility and presenting challenging conditions for any pilot. Captain Pahom and First Officer Sven Gunderson, both seasoned aviators with years of experience, were well aware of the difficulties that lay ahead. They meticulously went through their pre-flight checks, cognizant that this flight would require utmost precision. As Flight 239 ascended into the night sky, passengers settled into their seats. The cabin was filled with a mix of anticipation and festive spirit. Families whispered among themselves, children clutched toys, and the faint aroma of pine emanating from small Christmas gifts filled the air. The hum of the engines provided a soothing backdrop, masking the brewing tension in the cockpit. Approaching Oslo, the fog transformed into an almost impenetrable veil. Air traffic control provided clearance for an instrument landing approach, a procedure the pilots were well versed in. Relying heavily on their navigational instruments, they began their descent. Unbeknownst to them, a critical error was lurking within their equipment. A slight miscalibration in the altimeter was feeding them incorrect altitude readings. The terrain surrounding Oslo is notoriously rugged, with rolling hills and uneven landscapes that pose significant risks during low visibility approaches. As the plane descended through the thick fog, the erroneous altimeter readings misled the crew into believing they were at a safer altitude than reality. The situation was further compounded by the lack of ground proximity warning systems in aircraft at the time, a technology that could have alerted them to the impending danger. In the cabin, the atmosphere remained calm. Flight attendants began preparing for landing, and passengers were oblivious to the perilous situation unfolding. Suddenly, the tranquility was shattered by the sound of alarms in the cockpit. A fleeting glimpse of treetops appeared through the fogged windshield. "Terrain ahead! Pull up!" shouted Captain Holm. The pilots reacted instantaneously, pulling back on the control column in a desperate attempt to gain altitude. But fate had already cast its die. At precisely 10:32 p.m., Flight 239 collided with the forested hillside of Asker, merely miles from the runway. The impact was devastating. The left wing sheared off upon contact with the trees, and the fuselage broke into several sections as it plowed through the dense woods. Flames erupted as fuel tanks ruptured, illuminating the night with an eerie glow. Chaos ensued within the wreckage. Passengers were thrown violently. Luggage became deadly projectiles, and the once peaceful cabin was now a scene of utter devastation. Amidst the mangled metal and flames, cries for help pierced the cold night air. Some passengers were trapped within the twisted remains of the aircraft, while others, dazed and injured, stumbled away from the wreckage. Despite their own injuries, the flight attendants sprang into action. Training took over as they assisted passengers in evacuating, administering first aid, and comforting the terrified survivors. One attendant, with a fractured arm, repeatedly re-entered the burning sections to pull people to safety. Their heroism undoubtedly saved lives that night. Local residents, startled by the noise and the sudden glow in the forest, rushed to the scene, armed with flashlights and whatever medical supplies they could gather. They navigated the treacherous terrain to offer assistance. The community's response was swift and compassionate, embodying the spirit of unity in the face of tragedy. Emergency services faced significant challenges reaching the crash site. The dense fog and rugged landscape impeded access, delaying critical medical attention. Firefighters battled the flames, while medics tended to the injured as swiftly as conditions allowed. The severity of the crash became apparent as the night wore on. In the end, 40 of the 45 people on board perished. The nation was engulfed in mourning. Families awaited news with dread, the joyous anticipation of the holidays replaced by unimaginable grief. Norway, a country unaccustomed to such disasters, grappled with the collective trauma. The investigation into the crash was exhaustive. The Norwegian Accident Investigation Board meticulously reconstructed the events leading up to the tragedy. Flight data recorders, cockpit voice recordings, and fragments of the altimeters were analyzed in painstaking detail. The final report unveiled a series of unfortunate factors. Foremost was the malfunctioning altimeter, which had provided the pilots with altitude readings that were off by several hundred feet. In the enveloping fog, visual cues were non-existent, and the pilots' trust in their instruments became a fatal flaw. Additionally, there was a communication lapse with ATC. While they had noted the aircraft's descent path deviation, this was not effectively conveyed to the pilots in time to correct their course. The report also highlighted the absence of GPWSI, technology in the aircraft system that might have alerted the crew earlier to the impending collision with terrain. Recommendations were made for mandatory installation of such systems in all commercial aircraft. Furthermore, the investigation called for enhanced training protocols, emphasizing instrument cross-checks and emergency procedures during low-visibility operations. The emotional toll extended beyond the immediate circle of victims and their families. The tragedy sparked a national dialogue on aviation safety and the responsibilities of airlines and regulatory bodies. Memorial services were held across the country, with a significant ceremony in Asker, where a monument was erected to honor those lost. For the survivors and the bereaved, the path to healing was arduous. Support networks and counseling services were established, but the scars, both physical and emotional, would last a lifetime. Stories of individual heroism emerged, painting a complex picture of despair and courage. A father who shielded his son during the crash, sacrificing his life. A passenger who, despite severe injuries, coordinated rescue efforts until help arrived. Technological advancements in aviation were accelerated as a direct consequence of the crash. The implementation of GPWS became a priority, and altimeter manufacturing standards were rigorously reviewed and improved. Airlines across Norway, and eventually worldwide, adopted stricter maintenance schedules and more comprehensive pilot training programs, focusing on instrument reliability and emergency response. Public confidence in air travel wavered, but was gradually restored through transparent communication from airlines and demonstrable improvements in safety protocols. The legacy of Flight 239 lives on in these advancements, each a silent testament to the lives affected by that fateful night. The story of Broffin's safe Flight 239. is not just a recounting of a tragic event, but a powerful reminder of the intricate interplay between human skill, technology, and nature's unpredictability. It underscores the imperative of vigilance, continuous learning, and the relentless pursuit of safety in aviation. Thank you for joining me on this profound journey through aviation history. Your support enables me to uncover and share these pivotal stories with the respect and depth they warrant. By engaging with these narratives, we honor the memories of those affected and contribute to a collective commitment to safety and excellence in the skies. If this story resonated with you, please consider supporting the channel. Your contributions are invaluable, helping to sustain this platform and allowing us to delve into more stories that shape our understanding of aviation. Together, we can continue to remember, learn, and make a difference.